Hello, everybody. Welcome to this session of the World Council of Environmental and Resource Economists. The session is about biodiversity. Well, let me read the title correctly. Climate change, land use, and biodiversity. I want to read it in the correct order. And it is organized in collaboration with the Sisters Association of Environmental Resource Economists. So the American one, the Asian, the African, the Latin American. I hope I don't forget any other region of the world. And actually, the same session within the annual conferences of the other Sisters Association is run in their own conferences. And the reason why we decided to proceed this way is that we want to address the same problem, the same issue from different perspectives, from different regions. The issue is very broad, it's very challenging. Climate change, land use, and biodiversity. You know, there are three big topics, and each of them is a huge challenge. But the reason why we thought it was good to analyze them together is that there are strong interrelationships between these problems, somehow more than we imagined in the past. They have been treated separately as separate problems for a long time, but it's clearer and clearer that there are strong interconnections. And in a previous session organized by the European Association at the Conference of the Parties, we start analyzing the relationship between climate change and biodiversity at last COP in Dubai. But then we decided that we should bring on board also land use because of the connections that were emerging also from these sessions. So the problem is, how can we align the policies on climate change, the policies on biodiversity, the policies on land use, so that they talk to each other and they reinforce each other? Because we have serious tipping points in terms of global temperatures, in terms of species extinction, and in terms of land available that we risk to cross, or in some cases we have already crossed, I'm afraid. To discuss this issue today, we have some well-known speakers, and one of them is coming right now. And I was about, he deserves an applause for the perfect timing, because here I was about to say, we have 3 or 4 speakers. I don't know, now I can say 4 speakers. One is Ben Groom, who wanted to enter in a particularly effective way. The other is Gianni Guastella. We have Phoebe Koundouri, and now in the backstage, Ruslana Palakin. So I would suggest a structure of the session to have an 8 to 10 minutes presentation by each speaker, an opening remark, let's say, on your view concerning the interactions between these topics. And then I will have a second round of interventions based on questions that I would propose to the speakers. And then I would open up the floor to the audience. I forgot to say that this session is recorded and that we have also some participants online, and I hope the audio is good for all of you. So I will start by inviting Gianni to the stage. 2 words to introduce Gianni. Gianni is Associate Professor in Applied Economics at the Università Cattolica del Sacro, Cuore, Brescia. He is external consultant at Deloitte, and is also climate risk assessment is head of the unit on climate risk assessment at Deloitte again. He works on urban development and sustainable finance, particularly using data analysis on the economic and financial impact of climate change. And I forgot to say one last thing that I wanted to say. We're very thankful to Deloitte, who is supporting the conference and this session in particular. So we are very happy to have you, Gianni. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this very nice introduction. Can I use? Okay. Okay, so I will try to be very brief. The presentation is very general. The idea was to convey the message that, of course, we know that land use, biodiversity, and climate change are strictly related issues. As also Simone said in his introduction, they are all connected to the problem of planetary boundaries, and there are three topics in which we already know we are exceeding the planetary boundaries. We already know about the interconnection, but for some reason that is not difficult to grasp to the audience in the room, climate change has been prioritized in the last years. So climate change has been perceived as the most urgent challenge. And the idea of my presentation is to bring you the view of how we can capitalize the work we have already done on climate change for land use and biodiversity, given the strong connection between these three topics. The other thing we know about land use, climate change, and biodiversity, that they all need not only public responses, but also the response from the private sector. And the experience I want to bring is the experience as external consultant in Deloitte Climate and Sustainability, the experience I've learned engaging the companies in understanding what is climate change and addressing climate change in their strategies, because I think there is a great potential for upscaling of the experience we have had. Where everything starts, where the journey starts, well, in order to leverage the private sector, there's just one thing, again, in my experience, that you need to do, and this has to do with the disclosure. So firms, companies act not just because they want to be greener, but because in some way they are forced to do so. And one way to force them to do so is to ask them to comply with disclosure requirements. So basically the idea is that, okay, you have to disclose about climate change. And the initial idea of climate change disclosure was to allow firms or oblige firms to disclose their impact on the environment, which mainly means CO2 emissions. Okay. Now, something changed with the recommendation of the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, because for the first time they said in the non-financial disclosure, companies should not only report on the impact on the environment, but also on the impact that climate change and climate risk in particular could have on the company. Okay, which is a completely different thing, because it forces the company to think about what is the impact, the possible impact of climate risk on my company. And this has to do with the operative expenditure, with the capital expenditure, so the investment I have to make, with the loss of asset value due to extreme climate events, and all those things, okay, which are not part of the CO2 emission and so on. How this happens? I mean, in asking companies to do this kind of exercise, we identified two main challenges that are, in my opinion, shared with land use and biodiversity topics. The first is the long-term horizon, because when you talk with the company and they say, okay, you have to address these, they say, okay, I can do that in my business plan, which is basically 3 to 5 years, or I can do it in my financial plan, which goes to 10 years. But we all know that all those challenges require companies to think about the next 30 to 70 years. Okay, so the first challenge is the long-term horizon. The second is the uncertainty about policy, the uncertainty about technology, and the effects of combined policy and technologies on the economy. So if these are the challenges, what is the solution? The solution is long-term scenario analysis, which forces company to think in a forward-looking way, using forward-looking projections that cover the period up to the end of the century. And using scenarios, we can also get rid of the uncertainty, because with projections, we are able to represent not just one plausible future, but a lot of possible futures. In this, what is the role of science? First, providing the scenario data, high quality and reliable scenario data that can be used by companies for the integration in the financial plan. And second, inform about the possible transmission channels. So how these things, climate change, land use, biodiversity loss, are going to affect the value of the asset, the revenues, the OPEX and CAPEX, and by cascade, the margin and the profit, and most important for the financial system, also the probability of default. How we do that? We basically collect the current, okay, fine, company level data on asset revenues, OPEX and CAPEX at the, as of today. And then we use the standard statistical modeling to make the projections of the variable. And then we do apply the scenario shock. And then we analyze future plausible trends. And what you see on the upper right part is basically the projection of the EBIT. So it's basically the first margin, the operative margin of the company in the different scenarios. And the green is the net zero 2050. So it's below the 2 degrees, more or less. Okay. And what we say is that, oh, look, if you don't have a decarbonization plan, this is what is going to happen to your EBIT, so to your first margin. So you're gonna risk 7 to 13% loss compared to the current policies. However, the picture below, if you do have a proper decarbonization plan, then in the long run, look at the green line, you're gonna gain 1 to 6% compared to the current policy scenarios. And these are things that business understand, okay? Because it's about profit gain, margin loss, okay? So, in short, the disclosure is the starting point where the journey starts, but it's not the arrival. The arrival is the induction. So the fact that companies understand what's going on, what is at stake. And in this case, we are able to reach through these kind of instruments, through this kind of long-term scenario analysis, the internalization of externalities. Because if you go back, you see in the short run, there are costs. In the long run, you get the investment benefits in terms of margin gain, okay? And the same thing can be done for biodiversity and land use. So for the disclosure, I think I have 1 minute left. We already have, in Europe at least, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, and in the non-mandatory case, we have the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosure, the Biodiversity Standard of GRI, the Biodiversity Landscape of the Carbon Disclosure Project. So we have a lot of tools that are pushing companies in the direction of understanding the effects not only of climate change, but also of nature-related risks. So this covers both land use and biodiversity. What we are missing, on the other hand, is biodiversity and land use scenarios that need to be integrated most. There are, at least in part, but need to be integrated most in the climate change scenarios. Also, in this case, I see there is huge work being done. For instance, the NGFS framework for nature-related financial risk. I mean, these are big steps being made in this direction. We're trying to fill the gap, and I think it's something feasible in the next years. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Gianni. The point on the importance of disclosure and also the gaps in disclosures, I think are very important. We'll probably come back on this later on. I will now invite to talk Phoebe, just a few words of presentation, although I don't think are needed, but Phoebe, as you all know, is professor at Athens University of Economics and Business, research professor at the Denmark Technical University. She's director of, I think you pronounce it RISIS, the lab in Athens, at the Athens University of Economics and Business. And among the many roles, she's also director of the Sustainable Development Unit at the Athena Information Technology Research Center. She's in SDSN and many others. But the reason why you are here is not because of all your roles, no. And not even because you are a friend, no, but because you're an expert in interdisciplinary studies with a long expertise on this. And so even in previous events we had together on climate change and biodiversity, this emerged very clearly. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Simone. Can I have my slides? So what I'm gonna be talking about derives from AFAERE, this Alliance of Excellence for Research and Innovation on AFAERE, which means sustainability, that I founded and direct and brings together all the different institutions that I direct, chair, co-chair, or having very close partnerships in our network. And our focus is truly interdisciplinary. There is a big critical mass of econometricians, statisticians, economists, but we have 200 researchers with a big, coming from a big array of disciplines that we think are crucial in designing implementable pathways towards sustainability. This is the policy framework that we have today, and I focus on the European Green Deal. I've started with 2015, UN Agenda 2030, 17 goals, 169 targets, about 300 KPIs to measure performance against them, and then the best transposition of this framework into a policy framework, which is the European Green Deal, together with the industrial policy of the EU, the digital policy of the EU, the common agriculture policy of the EU, the nature and restoration law. Lately, recently, we've published in Nature an AI analysis that showcased the close connection between the SDGs and the European Green Deal framework. And I think this is important to know because it shows consistency across the globe and it provides a policy framework example for the rest of the regions of the world and continents. Are we doing well? Well, this is the 2024 UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network report where we measure the performance against each of the SDGs and each of the targets within the SDGs in each and every country of the world. And I've chose here the maps, the visual transposition of the performance of each and every country against 4 of the SDGs that I find relevant for this discussion today on climate, land use, and biodiversity. And you can see where you see red, it means not only we are below 50% of implementing the target, we are also in stagnation in terms of the needed progress to implement the target in 2030. And you see the first map is the food systems, a lot of reds. The second is climate action, a lot of red, and green, which means achieving the goal only in Africa where you don't have the industrialization popping in. Then the land use assessment, and then the marine use assessment, because biodiversity is not only on land, it's also in marine. And of course, climate change is affecting biodiversity in both areas. In this presentation, I'm gonna claim 2 things. First, in order to transit away from the current multi-crisis to a sustainable world, we need to know where we are. So we need these measurements of what is the current performance in each and every nation and at different scales. And then we also need a very holistic, integrated, and sensible framework that will allow us to design the pathways away from where we are towards the targets. What are the targets? The policies that I showed you before, okay? The European Green Deal has climate neutrality goals by 2050, has Fit for 55, 55% reduction in climate emissions by 2030, has the nature law, has the climate law, has the adaptation strategy, has EU taxonomy, has digital policies on digital twins incorporating nature, has industrial policy on the green and digital transition. So all these targets are set by policy. So our job, as I see it, is to figure out where we are today in an integrated way, in a way that allows interaction between the systems that we are managing. And I'm going to introduce the systems that I think are crucial and material. And then we need to pave and design the pathways that will allow us to move. This 2024 report showcases that we are on a very slow pace of implementation of the SDGs. The blue line is the projected line of the current trend in a global framework for all the SDGs on average, and what we need in order to have full implementation of the SDGs by 2030 is the green line. So we are not on a good pathway. And here is the before 2 weeks launch report of 2024 that showcases that, for example, for the food systems, SDG2, the marine systems, the land use systems, we have stagnation. We have below 50% implementation, but also stagnation towards 2030, while climate action is a bit better than 50% implementation. It's orange in color, but again, we have stagnation. And what we do in AFAERE, we don't only have the global report, but we realize that in order to figure out how we reach the policy targets, we need more detail. So we downscale from global to regional. So we have a European Union report, which is EU 27, including plus UK, plus the Balkans. I signed this report, and you can see even there, you have a lot of red and a lot of stagnation. Then we downscale by country. This is Greece. Then we even downscale even more by subnational level, because it's also important if you are gonna implement policies that has very localized nature, for example, climate adaptation policies, biodiversity policies, and we have even figured out a way to downscale to companies, and not just downscale to companies, but investigate along the value chain of the companies, what is the level of implementation of each SDG, and how they can close the gap between where they are projected to go and where they should go by 2030 or by 2050. And at this point, I should say that we are dealing both with product companies, but also with stock market companies. So this is how we measure where we are. The second part that I think is instrumental is to design the pathways to where we want to go. And this is the work of the Global Climate Hub of SDSN in collaboration under the auspices of the General Secretary of the UN and in collaboration with UNFCCC. The design of the hub is that it tries to develop the pathways to meet the policy targets using the current baseline, which we already measure. And the idea is that we have two levels of analysis. I will try to finish very quickly. We have the interdisciplinary science, with the different mathematical models, downscaling the climate scenario, the energy model, the land use model, the health system models, and then softly integrating all of them into socioeconomic models. And once we have the science base, then we come in with the interdisciplinary approach, transpose into a transdisciplinary co-design with the stakeholders in participatory, transformative, living lab, where we try to detail, based on the scientific results, the transition pathways. I will finish, 1 minute. It's not good? Okay, closer. This is the energy modeling, but I'm not gonna talk about that because we are talking about biodiversity and land use and climate in this one. But for land use and we also have other models for marine use, but I'm gonna focus on the land use. We have the Phoebe Consortium. So this is the Food Agriculture Biodiversity Land Use and Energy Consortium that tries to develop globally consistent mid-century national food and land use pathways. And basically we construct for each country 3 different pathways. We work on many countries across the globe, and one is the status quo, the other is the one that integrates all the national commitments, all the European commitments if you are EU 27, and then is the global sustainability one, which integrates all global commitments with the national commitments. And there you can integrate into these pathways different options of scenarios and figure out how a country can become climate neutral while achieving biodiversity targets, while achieving food security, and while achieving water security. And these are the structures for Greece, and you can see that our national commitments are not good enough to get us for this food system to climate neutrality by 2050. And then we even downscale a bit more, give more information and put the remote sensing information into the detail of Phoebe so that we uncover trade-off effects that are there but might not be obvious when you miss the detail of the spatial allocation of structures. And this is the analysis for water requirements and sustainable water systems integrated into food systems of Phoebe for the EU 27 countries. And finally, we also have a LAERE, which is an AI-based global valuation platform that tries to estimate the monetary value of externalities of natural capital in ecosystem services mode, of cultural capital, and also of social capital. And we try to integrate that into the socioeconomic modeling. And finally, we consider equity and inclusion issues. So if you implement these pathways, the integrated pathways between the energy system, the food system, the forest system, the health system, the marine system, if you integrate it into a socioeconomic system, how do you care for the vulnerable? In countries that you have fiscal space, like European countries, you can create packages of measures that increase inclusion, increase equity coefficients, but at the same time, they increase growth and job creation. However, there is a big discussion that even if Europe becomes climate neutral, is not enough. As we all know, everybody has to become climate neutral, and this is why the Global South is important, and you don't have fiscal space there to accelerate the transition and also implement the transition and also care for the vulnerable. So we are into discussions for changing the global financial architecture in order to provide multilateral and blended finance in order to accelerate the transition. There, I am advisor to G20 on this issue. And I finish by saying that even if you present the science and the detailed pathways, that are different for each country and are different for each local community within this country is not enough. You need to present them to the stakeholders, the politicians, the policymakers, the financial people, the business people, the civil society, and allow them to co-design based on their perception, their beliefs, their need, their local wisdom in a way. And what we find in the second layer of this transdisciplinary co-design approach is that one significant mobilizer of implementation is capacity. If the stakeholders know what you are talking about or understand or are given the capacity, the skills and knowledge to understand, then you have a chance to get serious implementation. We have done a study that we launched in COP27 and we show what are the skills and occupations that are needed in order to implement the already voted for European Green Deal laws and regulations for the twin transition, the green and digital transition. And we find that 80% of what is needed in terms of skills and occupations is not yet here. So even if you design the best science consistent, integrated, holistic pathways, you yet do not have the capacity to actually get implementation. And finally, all of this we try to save in an, again, AI infrastructure, the data, the models, the simulations, and then the tools, the DSS, the visual aids, dashboards that will enable all the stakeholders to have open access to the data, to the results, to the tools that you can use in order to get actual implementation. Thank you for your patience with the last line. The transition is complex, difficult, it's data and science hectic. And on top of this, it also needs serious engagement of the stakeholders, which can be achieved only if they have the capacity to understand.
Thank you, Phoebe, for the presentation, for the huge amount of work that you have done on these topics. Though somehow a bit depressing to see so many red regions in the maps. So there is a real huge gap between the scientific work and the implementation level. But we won't give up. Having said that, I would invite now Ruslana to come on board. A few words on Ruslana. Ruslana is the chair of the Department of Economics and Management at the Max Stern Yezreel Valley College. She is senior research fellow at the Natural Resource and Environmental Research Center at the University of Haifa. And she's also senior guest research scholar at IASA. She is working on bioeconomy, energy, climate change, environmental economics with quantitative methods, particularly on ex-ante modeling, and using computable general equilibrium models, integrated assessment model, since long, I would say, since, well, for some time, but let's say she has a long experience in the field. And what I find fascinating is her her effort of joining sectoral analysis and macroeconomic analysis. So you are on both levels of analysis. You have been working a lot on climate change, mitigation, adaptation, focusing on agriculture, land, and water. So based on your experience, I invite you to give us your wisdom on the topic.
Thank you, the organizers, Simone and Phoebe, for the opportunity to present at this prestigious event. Where is the clicker? Yeah, so I wanted to add to the discussion the perspective of bioeconomy and micro-macro analysis. We know that natural world provides us humans with essential services. We discussed them. Services provided by nature are indispensable input to economic activity, and we basically underestimate them still, like Phoebe said and Gianni said. And we know that climate change damages ecosystems, in turn impairing their ability to absorb carbon. I thought that this would be the starting point, so I think I should mention it, that over the past 20 years, Amazon has become a net source of carbon dioxide, emitting about 13% more than it captures. So the complex ecosystems tend to be taken for granted, and we need more analytical oversight. It's not a mere analytical oversight. We should incorporate them into our analysis. Recently, we have performed a literature review focusing on water and the ecosystem services, and we still find a lack of macroeconomic estimations of those two under the climate change stress. And what we think of the challenges that prevent us from dealing adequately with those natural resources, first of all, is the data limitation. Like we previously said, quantities of water are not largely known. And even less than that, costs of water or prices of water. Water is not priced in most of the regions of the world. The value of reclaiming water to restore ecosystems. If we introduce alternative water sources to prevent natural water scarcity, like treating wastewater or desalination, and we recharge natural water systems, what is the value of both those? Okay, on the one hand. And on the other hand, what is the negative impact of possible brine discharge? Sorry, okay. Then if there are project-based or local-based evaluations of ecosystem services, the scaling up is very challenging. So we cannot, usually we are limited in what can we say about large-scale systems from a local system analysis. So in an attempt to overcome some of those limitations in the recent project with Phoebe and her team, awesome project that just ended, funded by Prima Foundation, we basically incorporated water, natural water sources, and also alternative water sectors like the desalination treated water into global computer-generated equilibrium model in order to understand what is the value of the treated water and desalination practices, and also controlled environment agriculture as adaptation measures to climate change. So it was a heroic effort with a lot of data and estimations. And basically, we do see that we can, with using alternative water practices and controlled environment agriculture, bring about a positive trajectory in food security and global economy, with what is important, a negligible effect on the energy use, meaning not that much change in greenhouse gas emissions, even if not all the electricity production is from renewable sources. And it's alternative water sources and controlled environment agriculture can positively change climate adaptation and food security. Now, this is a starting point. Now, this next question should be, what is the value of preserving value for nature, of the negative externalities driven by brine, etc. So there are many additional aspects, not only the greenhouse gas emissions, that should be investigated in this aspect. Okay. Now, another point is that when we talk about the climate impact on agriculture, we usually talk directly, estimate direct impact of climate change on land productivity, on water, etc. Here in the paper, we tried to understand what is the effect of climate change on biodiversity, and from biodiversity on land productivity, on agricultural production. And again, we focused on, in this analysis, on the Mediterranean, and we found that for majority of non-EU Mediterranean countries, there is a significant negative impact on their national GDP due to climate change-induced impacts of biodiversity. So including biodiversity again with a precision estimation within climate change impact on the economy is extremely important. Now, I also promised to talk about bioeconomy. I will start with a definition because I think it's not clear what do we address as bioeconomy. So by definition, bioeconomy is utilizing renewable natural resources through biological processes like a biorefinery to substitute chemical processes from depletable natural resources like a refinery from oil, okay? So examples for sustainable resource use in the bioeconomy can be biomass production of agricultural residues, forestry byproducts, organic waste to reduce the reliance of fossil fuels, the marine bioeconomy like seaweed farming, bio-based materials for beta-carotene, biofibers, or biostimulants, carbon sequestration, waste to energy. And I want to continue with a bit more precise example, case study, is that there are evident benefits of bioeconomy, but there are also risks that we need to take into account. So here I want to discuss a peculiar case of a natural resource called algae, microalgae, seaweeds, or duckweed. They're peculiar because they have a huge growth rate. They grow 10 times faster than terrestrial crops. They don't compete for land and fresh water and can provide a sustainable alternative source of biomass for food, for feeds, for pharmaceuticals, fuel, and chemicals. And now they are discussed as potential for carbon sequestration. So here we collaborate with bioengineers, and there are some insights that I get and I want to share with you. Basically, they are discussed for decades now, and there is a traditional sector of algae cultivation in Asian cuisine. We all eat sushi, right? But still there is no one precise cultivation technology. Like we talk in the economics, what is the production function? They don't have the production function. There are still many uncertainties how to produce. And most importantly, there are, the biologists and the biotechnologists still don't know, for instance, to answer the question, whether the basic question, whether the seaweeds can trap CO2 for long periods of 100 years and longer to be effective in climate regulation, okay? So we need to start from technical, biological gaps that our colleagues should solve before we come to cost-benefit analysis to evaluating the specific technologies and their potential cost effectiveness. Another, and maybe the last slide that I would like to share before the questions, because I have additional slides for the questions. And we usually talk about lack of policy, but there are also cases of stringent policies. And I think it also is driven because of lack of our knowledge and information, okay? For instance, what you see here is the south of Israel. This is the Red Sea, which is known for its coral reefs. If you happen to be in Egypt for COP27 and dive there or something. Okay, so in Israel, we had a huge debate about the fisheries, aquaculture within the offshore Red Sea that harms the coral reefs. And there was a report that decided on how much permits of nitrogen discharge is allowed for annual allowances. So they decided about 22 metric tons of allowances per year. Already there are 25 metric tons of allowances given out for basically for water desalination, which is essential in this very dry region, okay? But it means that any economic or population growth is limited now because any project should come with 100% of nitrogen removal, which is a kind of a stringent constraint. So we need to understand better the impacts, the costs, and the benefits in order to make efficient policy decisions. So I will stop here and I will continue.
Thank you. Very interesting analysis that shows the level of interdisciplinarity that is already at work in many contexts and in specific contexts, by the way. They're region specific or sector specific. Okay, I now invite my latecomer, Ben Groom. Just a few words on Ben. Ben is a professor at the University of Exeter. He joined 2020 from LSE, where he was previously a professor. He is also co-chair of BioEcon, that you probably know that because it has been around for many years now, and it's a reference point for those working on biodiversity. And he works on biodiversity, as you can imagine, and also on how the financial sector and the consumer behavior can be changed to align with the biodiversity targets, let's say. He is a member of His Majesty Treasury Biodiversity Working Group, and he has a long experience starting with a PhD at UCL, where we probably met many years ago, and then moving on to become also a consultant for many governments, and also for the United Nations and the WWF, OECD, and other governments. So, Ben, your experience is precious to have your view on these topics based on the different fields that you analyze in your years.
Okay, I don't have any slides, and the reason for that was I thought I'd be able to look kind of thoughtful and and you know, sort of have some gravitas without the slides. But now that I've entered like a boxer entering the ring, that kind of image has disappeared a little bit. I'll stick to the script though. What I want to talk to you about is, firstly, I want to talk about this nexus between climate change and biodiversity. I want to talk very briefly about some of the macro elements of this, and then moving on to some quite micro-based elements about nature-based solutions. And then I want to conclude with just a point about political economy of environmental policy. So the first thing I wanted to talk about was the research that's been done on climate change and the environment. And we have a kind of a rich, I'm going to be mainly economic about this. We have a rich strand of research on this area, starting, I think, really from post-Stern review, the even Sterner review by Thomas Sterner and Martin Pearson. You know, and their main point was that our typical analysis of climate change, which really is leading towards this policy relevant outcome, the social cost of carbon, which we should be using to price carbon, is lacking some of the crucial dimensions in the damage, in the terms of the damages and loss of ecosystem services. So we see the work by the even Sterner review. We have excellent work by Martin Hansel is at the end. I just see his end at the back of the room here, and Moritz Drupp, and also by Fran Moore and Bernardo Bastian Olvera. What they try to do is basically bring together the ecosystem service side with the climate change analysis. And what Martin and Moritz were basically trying to do is think about how we value things in terms of preferences here. So what are the relative price changes that take place when climate change evolves and ecosystem services are knocked out, and how does that affect our policy, our social cost of carbon? It turns out quite a lot, actually, you know, more or less 60% increase in the social cost of carbon, in some cases more. That's the same as like reducing the discount rate by about 6.6%, 0.7%, something like that. So once you start thinking about ecosystem services in the context of climate change, it has real policy implications in terms of these accounting prices that we use in cost-benefit analysis. What Fran Moore and Bernardo Bastianelli did is they think about the production side, not just on preferences and how we value things as things get more scarce, but really how does climate change affect ecosystem services which contribute to the productivity of the economy directly. And again, this leads to increases in social costs of carbon and so on. Recently, I saw presentations from Martin Quast's group in Leipzig, who are extending these models. And they're getting closer and closer and closer to what I think Partha Dasgupta had in mind in the Dasgupta review, which was sort of embedding the economy in the environment itself, right? And bringing to bear some of the constraints, possibly, that the biodiversity and ecosystem services bring to our analysis of economic growth. Okay, so there's a kind of a rich area there of macroeconomic research, which has kind of broad policy outcomes. But of course, just because the social cost of carbon or the optimal path leads to less than 1.5 degrees doesn't mean that it's actually going to happen. But we see other positive things happening there as well. So if we look at the latest review of the A4, A94, the kind of cost-benefit analysis guidelines in the USA, and the way in which they treat greenhouse gases, you see increases in the social cost of carbon, which reflect to some extent some of these advances. $190 per ton of carbon, which is quite considerably higher than the $7 per ton of carbon under Trump, right? So we see this this kind of research helping, pushing things in the right direction. On the relative prices story, again, we've made collectively contributed to public consultation on the A4, A94, trying to encourage governments to include relative price increases for ecosystem services in the same way as they do for, let's say, the value of time saved in cost-benefit analysis, which increases at the growth rate of income, right? So we're seeing kind of changes there, and it's coming from this thinking about ecosystem services together with climate change. All right, I want to say something about nature-based solutions now, moving on quickly. So this is another area where climate and biodiversity seem to come together, right? In the kind of reforestation, avoided deforestation context, right? And we see this as lots of people see this as a kind of an important growth area in terms of climate solutions, as well as solving simultaneously some of the biodiversity concerns that we have. But at the same time, so two things about that. First of all, carbon and biodiversity, not the same thing. It doesn't, just because you have some forests doesn't mean you've got biodiversity. There's a lot of texture there in that kind of nature-based solution area in terms of peatland. We've seen some in the previous presentations, in terms of peatlands and grasslands and plantations, which aren't really biodiversity, and primary forests and such. So we need to bear those kind of differences in mind. And in terms of how the finance in this area works, we've really been relying on, sort of carbon credits and offsetting markets in order to build a lot of I mean, we've got REDD+ as well. I'm ignoring that, but let's focus in on the offsets market and the carbon credits. Now here, of course, we have huge concerns. In the recent years, we've seen papers by Thales West and Andreas Kontolian at Cambridge, and Pissar and from the Andrew Bamford's team in Cambridge, showing that the kind of additionality of carbon credits in tropical forest areas has basically been about 10%. So meaning that 90% of these credited carbon credits would have happened anyway. Right? So what is going on there, and how useful is that market in carbon offsets? Well, Frank Vemmans and I have a paper which sort of suggests, well, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater just yet. But what it does is the following. It tells you, I mean, I've presented this paper about 100 times now, so if this is for the few people who may have missed this, it basically says that the worry with offsets as well is that they're not just, they're non-additional, but also they're temporary, right? And they're risky, they can go up in flames. And so come on, how is this a long-term solution? Well, the formula that we put together basically says, look, you can price that in any way you want. And it depends on the risk parameters, it depends on the additionality risk, and it depends on the duration. But you can price that in as long as you have transparent information on those particular features of those projects, okay? So when it comes to it, calibrating that formula, if you calibrate it according to 90% non-additionality, then you're going to need sort of something like 25 tons of forest offsets to be equivalent to 1 ton of emissions reduction there. Okay, so it works, but it really kind of prices out many of these nature-based solutions if you want to have any kind of equivalence to emissions reductions, or indeed begin to start using them as offsets. So that's a problem. And so what we end up with here is a kind of a market that looks very much like the market for lemons, right? You've got secondhand cars out there, yeah, which are the offsets that you see. And why does this occur? It's because I don't know the quality of my offset, right? When I'm buying it, I just know that maybe broadly I know the average value of this offset and what it's doing to reduce climate damages. So what does that mean? That the market kind of unravels. I think this is my assumption of what's going on. The market kind of unravels until we have some low quality, very cheap offsets out there in the market. Okay, so that's one point. The next point is that in a kind of in a typical lemons market, I was talking to my colleague Ian Bateman the other day, and we were talking about this story. He's at Exeter with me, and he was saying, oh yeah, about the secondhand car market. He grew up in Birmingham, and he was saying, yeah, well, back in the day, you know, we would buy almost any car if it had a Blaupunkt radio in it, you know. Jim, I'm showing my age. I'm showing his age and my age now. For that, but I don't know if that's a thing still. But anyway, that meant kind of a decent radio cassette player in your car. You know, you add this on to this lemon of a car, and people love it, right? So, what the question is, what is that in the context of the offset market? Well, I have a feeling that it may well be biodiversity. All right, I have a feeling that, because we see a lot of carbon offsets trying to stack up biodiversity side and differentiate themselves in that way. And I should at this point say that there is quite a bit of regulation and not regulation, but scrutiny of this kind of process from various organizations, some of which are better than others and so on. But that I think is what's going on there. There's a kind of an attempt to improve those offsets by stacking on other kind of things which other people might feel beneficial. All right, now that's not to say that stacked benefits, you know, paying for these stacked up benefits isn't a bad idea at all. You know, we probably do value reforestation or avoided deforestation. That also provides high quality biodiversity, and that's what this whole initiative is trying to do. A good example of that is in the UK, where we have nature-based solutions for some phosphates emissions. Now, in some parts of the country, there simply isn't enough space for nature-based solutions. What you really need is some stacked up benefits of wetlands for biodiversity in order to make that a viable kind of nature market and so on. Okay. Now, what this is moving towards as well, thinking now less about carbon offsets, is towards biodiversity credits. And there is a proliferation of biodiversity crediting out there. This is a thing whether you like it or not, but I think it suffers probably from the same kind of concerns as the carbon offset market. But here, the kind of what's the word? The theory of change for biodiversity credits is really more strongly based than for offsets, carbon offsets, on the idea of CSR and reducing reputational risk, I'd say. There isn't no kind of global target against which these biodiversity offsets are really being hedged against, whereas with carbon offsets, at least somebody can say, I'm trying to achieve the kind of Paris Accord, and there are many kind of regulatory devices, which are disclosure devices, which are trying to do that. So I'm a bit skeptical about biodiversity credits as a thing, a major solution to the biodiversity crisis. They may well provide some finance here and there, but they get measured in very different ways. So a typical measure for a biodiversity credit is MSA, means species abundance, right? And the reason for that, as far as I can make out, is because we have these off-the-shelf tools which provide global measures for MSA for any company who are interested. Okay. But who made MSA the measure of interest here? Means species abundance. And how does that relate to anything that people value, or indeed ecologists value? It's not entirely clear why that. And then the other question is fungibility. So a carbon credit in one place presumably ought not to be traded with a carbon credit in another place, because the MSA in one place is a very different set of species and characteristics to the MSA in another place. So I'm a bit sort of skeptical about that. And of course, what we also need to be concerned with biodiversity credits is the whole issue of additionality again. So I was lucky enough to examine a PhD recently by a student called Vincent Guy, apologies for pronunciation, but excellent. He looked at the biocarbon, the biofuel mandates in the USA, which is a massive land use intervention to grow biofuels in the USA, which of course displaced particular other food crops, right? And he charted empirically how that spread out across land use frontiers around the world, right? So you've got these spillover effects which occur from any large-scale land use intervention, which pop up in different parts of the world. I dare say similar things would have happened with the moratorium on palm oil in Indonesia as well, but that's as yet unstudied. I know for a fact that my colleague Sabrina Eisenbach has a very nice study where she shows that kind of interventions in the fisheries, in global fisheries, has spillover effects to other fisheries. So if you intervene in Japan, this kind of, there are spillovers in other, because this is an international market, right? So these are really important issues in the context of biodiversity, nature-based solutions for climate change, which I think we need to bear in mind. And again, sort of have raised my skepticism of some of these instruments, including disclosure instruments, to solve any of the problems that we face. All right, last point on political economy. I'll be very brief. We are lucky in the UK that we have legislated for climate change reductions, and we've legislated for nature positive outcomes. We have the Environment Act 2021, we have the Climate Act in 2008. You know, this means that it's a cross-party agreement on how climate change and biodiversity and nature is going to be treated within the confines of the UK. We have had an election recently. Well, we haven't, it's on Thursday. We're in the throes of an election at the moment. And this, like between the two main parties, this has not become a wedge for them, right? There's a bit of humming and ahhing about net zero and so on, but really it's not really bitten. But I was reminded by a paper by Emanuele Campiglio and his co-authors, who are called Francesco Lamperti and Roberta Terranova. They have a beautiful paper out in the Journal of Economic Dynamics and Control, which basically makes a point that I think we're all familiar with, that actually if we're going to rely on the private sector to invest and have directed investment in environmental solutions, we need to have extremely secure political support for the targets that we have in place. Any kind of watering down, and we've seen it a little bit in the UK, but any kind of watering down on the net zero pledges or the interim pledges or whatever, and this changes the incentives that are faced by the private sector tremendously and really cools off investment. And in their paper, they show that this can lead to kind of really bad equilibrium of high carbon, low investment equilibria in the future. So that's one thing. We need to have kind of stay the course a bit. And in other countries in Europe, we're not quite seeing that, you know. And then lastly, of course, I was reminded I just saw him outside actually, Jan Steckel's work on the political economy of coal, where he basically talks about the difficulties of implementing and transiting away from coal and how that depends on the kind of demand for low energy prices and the power of the the coal lobby, and all sorts of intricacies about the individual countries in hand. And the same thing is true for biodiversity. You know, it amazes me the power of the agricultural lobby in here, which is, in my view, the kind of eversion of the coal industry in the context of biodiversity. So these political economy issues are extremely important and are probably behind some of the failures that we witnessed, that Phoebe was showing us in the previous presentation. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ben. Many, many interesting points that you raised across different aspects that are actually very close to my heart, I have to say. You mentioned biodiversity credit, carbon credits, the political economy aspects, many reflections on the table. I would like to open the floor to questions. I was planning to ask some questions, but maybe given the time, I would suggest that we open the floor to the audience, and if there are questions, if not, I have plenty of them.
I'll start with maybe an unfair question. And Ben, you got at some of this, but I'd love to hear from the panelists when you think about climate change, carbon, and biodiversity. What are the areas where the potential sort of complementarity of policy exists, in places where there's sort of thinking about it from where research would be valuable, right? So there's the win-wins, the happy side of the story. And then also, what are the specific examples where our goals around carbon are in direct conflict with our goals around biodiversity? And what sort of research do we need to do there?
Difficult question to start with. Who wants to give a try? Maybe.
When we are developing these pathways, which are basically dynamic mixtures of technologies, policies, and finance that bring implementable outcomes. And we look at when we try to integrate, for example, the energy system, which is very explicitly giving us pathways and effects on reducing emissions. And then we come in to develop the pathways for agriculture. And there we have the methane emissions that are becoming explicit. And the difficulty there, the difficulty that we find there is, and Ben has referred to this, when we move away from the agricultural sector and we continue to the forest sector, it becomes very complicated to calculate the effect of reforestation, afforestation, and biodiversity, because we don't have explicit models that translate the quantities into climate effects, into emission effects, into storage of CO2 and other carbon and other climate-related emissions. So for me, the obvious difficulty that is always there is that we don't know how long it takes for an area that where you implement, for example, reforestation to become a serious carbon sink. You don't know whether afforestation will work at the end of the day. You don't know exactly how to get biodiversity into your agriculture production in order to avoid collapse of ecosystems. In order to figure all this out, you need to go into very detailed very low scale, very minimum scale remote sensing information. And even then, the scientists that work on biodiversity and forestry cannot give you the precise effects that the energy modeling will give you, that will tell you what is the optimal mixture between solar, wind, geothermal, hydrogen, and when it's best to put the new technology in, and what is the optimal mixture. So there is some uncertainty with regards to that. And on the other side, and I will close with this, when you try to incorporate the valuation of the changes that you are producing with the implementation of the policies and the technologies and the investment you are suggesting as the optimal dynamic mixture, we find that the preferences on which we base our valuation calculations are mobile. That is, they are changing, and they are a dynamic function of the most recent natural disaster, of the most recent big news on biodiversity collapse. So even on the demand side, when you try to put the valuation in, you don't have any confidence in the dynamic robustness of your calculations. So it's a difficult job. Yeah, I don't know if
Okay, a difficult question. It took me a long time to come up with an example, but I think it's one that relates a lot to what Phoebe's saying, but it may be slightly different. So when we were thinking about our social value of offsets paper, which is trying to value these kind of temporary, risky, kind of non-additional nature-based solutions, we're now moving on to thinking about learning by doing. And so like whatever you implement, there's an opportunity cost in terms of what you don't implement and then you're not learning about, right? So it could be that despite nature-based solutions being extremely cheap and having potentially other important co-benefits, that not implementing kind of some of the more engineering solutions, you lose out on that kind of stock of learning by doing from how you're implementing those particular things. So there's a lot we don't know about that, and we're yet, I think on sort of carbon capture and stuff, we're yet to have that kind of massive reduction in prices. So there's a trade-off for you. I managed to find one. Maybe that makes sense.
Okay.
Hello, Damien Dussault from the OECD. One question, especially for Phoebe. How do you take into account geographical spillovers across countries or regions within countries, like air pollution or nutrient runoff when designing the pathways? Are the national pathways socially optimal for the country considered? Or is it socially optimal at a greater scale? And how do you reconcile that with the political economy aspects and countries looking first at their own interests?
Yes, very useful questions. On the spillovers, in the way we measure the level of effects on, I will give you an example with the SDGs. So we have a model which is called trade spillovers on the SDGs. And we investigate, it's built, we can share it with you, the value chain of a product and measure based on this value chain the effects, positive or negative, of on the different SDGs. And for example, I can refer to a very recent paper which showcases that 60% of deforestation in Brazil is basically supporting production mainly in Europe. So we've developed a model that details these effects across the value chains of products and goods and services. And this is very important because, and also in the report, in the Sustainable Development Report, we also have a measure of the positive and negative spillover effect of each country on its region. But we went beyond that and have these international value chains. Then the second question was about, and this is very important what you said on the spillover. Okay, when we try to design pathways, for example, the favorable pathways that are on the food systems and integrating forest systems, we have the national commitments. That is what the country is committed to do based on the compulsory regulation, either from the EU or from national regulation, and then the global sustainability. Now, like I said before, Europe, the two are very close. But for example, if you go to other continents, Latin America, the North, the US, because Canada is much better, Asia, then the divergence between what is optimal for the country and what is optimal for the globe is big and different. And this basically, it's showcasing the need for international agreements to have implementation power. Otherwise, they are not going to work and they are not going to mobilize what is needed to be mobilized in order to implement the transition. And it's so different. I mean, you can see that outside Europe, the global and the national thing is different. And sometimes the national, unless it is downscale and differentiated between the sub-regions of the countries. Connor has done a study on this for each and every country in Europe with our team. And you see how non-harmonized is the optimal pathway, or the pathway that will get you to the target on time, even within sub-regions of the country. And the third question was? And how difficult it is to have the political economy of all this sorted out. So for me, you know, when you have such a serious issue in your hand, which is accelerating in the negative outcomes, and it's an existential issue, you cannot rely only on incentives. What we are doing in Europe is good, regulating, just trying to refine our regulation in a way that allows all other stakeholders to keep up to pace. So there is a trade-off between the perfect regulation and a regulation that is good enough to get you somewhere that is reasonable and you can survive on it.
Thank you very much, all of you. It's been very interesting. Apparently my hand was the only one right now, so I will have 3 questions. Take the chance when I have one. Sorry, but I can't remember your names, but to the man without a PowerPoint slide to the right. In some of my sort of corporations that I work around, they try to get this carbon offsetting on the ground and also get the social dimension in. I mean, I guess it's difficult enough what you're trying to discuss in this policy session, but improving and including the social dimension into carbon offsetting, showing local advantages to local communities of the offsetting project has been sort of discussed in the world I'm in, to get this on board, make it happen. And maybe that's on the political economy aspect, that could be a way forward to get these things to work. So I was wondering if you had considered this local social aspects of these projects. That was question 1. Question 2 to the man in the middle, also forgot your name, but you had a PowerPoint, so I saw your graphs. And when you mention the long-term gains versus short-term losses, I just want to double check on the discount rates. I mean, corporations usually work with very short timeframes when they make investments. And have you taken those corporate level discount rates or interest rates or return of investments into that graph? So I just want to double check so that your message is not a classic discounting problem. It was not okay. And third, I work much with air pollution and climate change, synergies and conflicts, right? And then we've been discussing co-benefits and synergies for a long, long time. And I've come to the argument that I think that for this policy context, there are good enough solutions that we can create rule of thumbs. So for air pollution and climate change, for example, I would argue that combustion of woody biofuels would be a trade-off between air pollution and climate change. And as a rule of thumb, basically, it will not match in every single situation, but as a rule of thumb, which I argue, I do think that would be needed here as well if we want to push the policy further, because the science with this super complex, multi-integrated systems with interconnections and wicked system definitions that you are working with, I would argue that at some point, shouldn't there be an effort to develop rule of thumbs? Or maybe there already are rule of thumbs for what should be a fairly good co-benefit between these three policy aspects that we're discussing today. So that was question number 3.
Thank you. 3 interesting questions. I will start from the men who know PowerPoint presentation.
Oh yes, I'm registered yet. I haven't got my badge on, so me. So great question, and it reminds me several things to be said in. So this is the point about community benefits to community, local communities from kind of carbon projects. So first thing, this is of great concern, I think, in the industry, and there are examples, just as there were with sort of fair trade labels and such like, where local communities have not really benefited that much. In fact, a bit like the protected areas back in the 60s and 70s. You know, it's actually led to exclusion of people from particular places. So it's important what you're doing in terms of bringing those issues to bear and differentiating yourself from differentiating from other offsets which aren't doing that. It's an important issue. Second issue is that in the context of the Guardian report, which which basically drew from Andreas Contoglion's paper and those other papers at that time, where non-additionality was clearly a massive problem. One of the arguments that came back in conversations with offsetting companies that I've had recently was, yeah, but come on, we're financing local communities here, and so you sort of think, well, fine, but if your concern is a development concern, right? If your concern really is about local development, rural development, is this approach the best way of getting finance towards that? Why not? I mean, I'm speculating, right? But presumably there are more important or more appropriate pathways for finance if you're really concerned about rural development, right? So that's one thing. It also reminds me of the literature on payments for ecosystem services more generally from the sort of early 2000s onwards. I'm thinking about the work by Paul Ferraro and Charles Palmer and these people who basically looked at the kind of trade-off between programs which just purely focus in on the environmental aspects, the benefits, and those which try and do both, like the integrated conservation development programs and so on. The early evidence was that those that tried to do integrated conservation development were not very good at hitting both targets, right? So you either got one or the other. Paul Ferraro's research tends to show that it's a mixed story, right, depending on where you are. But I guess the overall point would be, do you want your intervention to be targeted on one thing? As economists, we would typically like that. We prefer one instrument for each problem, right? And or do we want to be trying to hit an average of different objectives and possibly failing? So as I say, the evidence on this seems to be mixed, but that's what I know about that particular question.
Thank you. I will take the second one about the discount rate. As you may have guessed, there's no discount rate. I mean, we just look the projections of key performance indicator at the company level. The objective of the exercise is not that of computing net present value, understanding how much the firm is worth right now, but rather allow the company to understand where it is and where it may go. In fact, the results are expressed in terms of percentage change differential between a given scenario and the current policy scenario. So we're not going to give the company the real numbers, also because my feeling is that they are not really interested in the real numbers because the time horizon is too far away. Okay, they look at the real numbers like in the next 3 to 5 years, and that's why we may fail arguing that, yeah, you need a decarbonization strategy, as I'm showing you. And they say, okay, but I think just about the next 3 to 5 years, that's why I'm going to buy carbon credits. That's my solution. And in contrast, the objective of the exercise is to force thinking in the long term and taking the different perspective of the different scenarios.
Can I say something?
I wanted to address the third point, but without the, I will not address the rule of thumb, but I wanted to mention the air quality and climate change connections, and maybe to connect between different questions and the impact on biodiversity. First, I'm helping, or I try to shape the carbon policy in Israel, right? We are not members of EU. We don't have regulation, but CBAM hopefully drives the local policymakers to understand the need to move towards carbon tax. What we did in our analysis, we showed on net, there is net benefit from carbon tax for the country of Israel. But it's not obvious actually, because it's a small country in the Mediterranean. The impact of climate change is not that significant, but the costs are rather high. And most of the benefit comes actually from the reduction of local air pollutants that are driven as spillovers from, so there are spillovers from carbon policy local and carbon policy from Europe to the positive externalities. Then another aspect that I wanted to address is again, maybe the contradictory and complementary policies that were mentioned before, or between biodiversity and climate change, and even not policies, but public perceptions. When we discussed the renewables that we will use in Israel, naturally we don't have much water, okay, so hydropower and other base load of renewables is not really there, so we have a lot of solar naturally, and wind, okay, some of wind. And the major opposition we got was from bird watchers, okay, so bird preservation, because Israel is in the connection between migration from, yes, Africa and Europe. And there was actually a video that I saw that the biologists show policymakers where there is, you know, a propeller of a wind turbine and an eagle flies around it and gets hit and is dead, okay? But there is no visual about coal, air pollution, yes, and the impact on birds or from other, you know, air pollution that hits not only a specific bird, but the whole biodiversity and the environment and the human health, etc. So I think that we made, following this video, we made a study, and we didn't find actual account of any bird in it, because this video was from the US. Okay, so the number of actual accidents is negligible, but the propaganda that they make is huge to shape the policy not in the right direction. No.
Can I say something about the rule of thumb? I would say that why use the rule of thumbs if you have models that produce pathways in the detail that they can be implemented. We have the models. They are not perfect. That's why they are models. If they were perfect, they would have been mathematical equations without any stochasticity. We have enough and quite good research focused to help the implementation of climate, food security, and biodiversity policy at national and subnational level. Yeah, please.
Yes, exactly. Right about that. My experience, though, is that, well, this is a scientific conference, but
Say it.
at sometimes people don't trust the models and the modelers. So it can be that a sub-national level, they won't buy what the model says.
I truly I have experienced what you're saying. As Climate Hub, we work in 120 countries. We have national, we call them transformative living labs with representatives for all the stakeholders. It takes at least 2 years after you have your simulations and suggested science-based pathways to convince the local stakeholders at the different scales to trust you. First, it takes 6 months for them to agree where they are now, to agree what is the level of implementation of each policy now. Even between them, they don't agree. And then it takes up to 2 years to build the trust to allow you to give them a detailed enough, but also understandable enough pathway for implementation. And the more they get the capacity to understand, the more they trust you. So for me, the biggest lacking investment in the developed work, because in the developing work you have many others, is a serious budget on upskilling and reskilling, and also revising curricula in the education system and most probably in the universities, according to the skills and knowledge that you need to understand interdisciplinary science, and especially focus on the interaction between the economy and natural systems. It's not there yet, and it's needed.
Yes, I have a short comment question. I'm Oscar Melo from Catholic University in Chile, and also a member of the Latin American Economics and Resource Association. So, on the same topic, I wanted to illustrate something that goes on in my country. So we have also a platform, and now we have a climate change law. I'm currently working on the adaptation plan on biodiversity. And this platform is now legally binding. So every region, every ministry, every local government has to use this platform for their climate change plans. And not only that, also every company that makes a new project, say they build a bridge or whatever, they have to use it to assess what are the risks for them. So I was wondering, how is the experience here in Europe in terms of using this type of binding instruments to project and to manage the risk for climate change and biodiversity in general?
Okay, we are close, but who wants to take this question? 1 minute.
There are varied experiences. For example, there are countries that have very efficient platforms, like the one you have in Chile. For example, for their adaptation plan at local level, but they are missing on the mitigation plan because it's national and it's not integrated with the adaptation plan, and it's not integrated with the land use aspects. So we have many platforms. We also have the European Economic and Social Committee that has launched 5 years ago a very big platform for all the stakeholders to work together at the European level, downscaling and national level. But the experiences are for serious variation in terms of quality, in terms of the numbers that are using it, and we don't have anything compulsory. For example, there is the Climate Adaptation Initiative within the European Green Deal. And the idea is that every region in every country has to submit a climate adaptation plan. If you go there, it's not there on time for all the regions in all the countries. Then we have the climate energy, climate and energy plans for each country. Some are very upscale and vague, and others have detailed pathways. So there is, even at compulsory level, even at legal obligation level, we don't have the same quality in terms of what is actually being designed to be implemented.
I think that we cannot finish this session before asking about the European Nature Restoration Law, because I'm curious. This is a question, not mine, but Simone posed, but I would like to ask Simone, do you think that this law, what would be the potential impact? What do you think about it? Maybe you present in few words, the law, the idea, and what is the potential impact?
This is an experiment because is it cool? Yeah. No, okay. Well, I take it with much pleasure because the European Nature Restoration Law is basically the attempt to take biodiversity into account and create a legislative framework around it. And it has provoked strong feelings. And I'd like to go back to what Ben was saying, because I think there is a political economy aspect that we should study more. And I'm fully convinced that there is an agricultural lobby that is for biodiversity as exactly what the, let's say, the oil and gas lobby has been for climate change. And I have seen this coming before actually the farmers' protest exploded in an event that we ran in Siena at my university, in which we had member of parliament for different countries. And one of them was, I have to say, creating misinformation on the nature restoration law, creating the kind of conflicts rather than synergies that was mentioned in one of the questions. So pretending this to be in contrast with the climate targets. So I think as scientists, we have an obligation to fight this misinformation. I'm not saying things are easy. I'm not saying that there are synergies all the time. I know there are trade-offs, but certainly the kind of misinformation shows that there is a lobby. And so the farmers' protest, for me, and I think for some of my colleagues who were there, did not come by surprise, because somehow it was prepared by some misinformation. So we really need to work hard on addressing this problem, on stressing the synergies and, you know, not hiding the trade-offs. But these trade-offs can be addressed with proper policies. And on this note, I think we have to close. The chair answered the question, so it's really time to close. And Ben has to go and register. So I'd like to thank you all. It has been a very interesting debate. I have a lot of questions more, so I think we'll have to have a follow-up for the next years. Thank you all.